consistent with the testimony she offered during not custodial, but at the interview with the police on November 23rd, 2010.
Testimony would be what?
I said it's consistent with the
No,
testimony.
but before that, you said what was she going to say?
She's going to say that she did find out about the kids being found in the tub the day the bodies were discovered, November 20th, 2010, and that she discussed that with Mr. Segura. That's not what she said.
Your Honor, this is exactly what I had the conversation about with earlier, that we were gonna get into the back and forth. I kind of figured.
We're not going to do that. All right, I sustain the objection. Let's have a jury, please.
All rise for the jury.
Everybody be seated. You may resume with the
Yes, Your Honor, I
video.
apologize. Gotta get that projector one going. Apologize, I didn't realize it had shut off.
So you'll need your transcript.
I'd like to clarify a couple of issues with you, if I could.
Señor Ávila, me gustaría clarificar un par de temas con usted, si me permite.
Sí.
Yes.
You indicated, while you were talking to Mr. Hughes, that the boat you were ultimately arrested on was boarded by you and others off the coast of Peru. Is that correct?
Usted le indicó al señor Hughes que en el barco que ustedes lo arrestaron fue abordado por ustedes en la costa del Perú, ¿correcto?
En el Perú no fuimos arrestados, nosotros salimos del Perú.
We were not arrested in Peru, we were left from Peru.
But to be clear, that boat was under the control of a Colombian drug cartel delivering cocaine for a Colombian drug cartel.
Pero para estar en claro, ese barco estaba bajo control de un cartel de droga colombiano para entrega de narcóticos para el cartel de droga colombiano.
Sí.
Yes.
And ultimately, that delivery of cocaine was intended for the United States by way of Mexico, correct?
Pero en últimas, esa carga de cocaína se intencionaba que llegara a los Estados Unidos vía México.
No tengo conocimiento si iba para los Estados Unidos porque mi trabajo solo era entregarlo a un barco mexicano.
I do not have any knowledge of whether it was going to the United States because my only job was to deliver it to a Mexican ship.
When you say a Mexican ship, you mean it was intended for members of a Mexican drug cartel for distribution, correct?
Y cuando se refiere usted a un navío mexicano, se refiere a que se le estaba enviando a un cartel mexicano para distribución, ¿correcto?
Pero no sé, no tengo conocimiento porque a nosotros nomás nos dicen, en esta posición vas a encontrar este barco, no nos dicen quién es el nombre del capitán, nada, no hay información. ¿Quién lo recibe?
I don't have any knowledge of that because all they tell us is we have to meet a certain boat at a certain location. They don't even give us the captain's name. We don't get any information whatsoever.
Well, who was it then that you believed you were delivering a multi-ton quantity of high purity cocaine to?
Entonces, ¿a quién pensaba usted que le estaba entregando una tonelada de cocaína de alta pureza?
No, las personas solamente las vi cuando en el momento de entregarla, pero uno no puede preguntar nombre ni nada, solamente entregar y regresar a Colombia.
I saw these people at the moment of the delivery, but at that moment you can't even ask their names or anything. You just have to deliver it and go back to Colombia.
All right, I want to change gears and ask you about your knowledge of Tallahassee.
Quiero cambiar de página para preguntarle a usted acerca de su conocimiento de Tallahassee.
You indicated that you heard Tallahassee was the capital of Florida at some point. When was that? Where was that? You were in Tallahassee, Florida.
Usted indicó que se había enterado que Tallahassee es la capital de la Florida. ¿En qué momento se enteró usted y en dónde estaba de que Tallahassee es la capital de la Florida?
Cuando yo estaba en la prisión de Talladega, Alabama,
When I was at the prison in Talladega, Alabama,
Mr. Avila,
le escribí al gobernador Jeb Bush, que era gobernador en ese tiempo.
I wrote the governor, Jeb Bush. He was governor at the time.
Mr. Avila, isn't it true that as of last week, you were telling us you had never heard of Tallahassee until you were contacted by State Attorney's Office Investigator Jason Newland regarding this case?
No es cierto, señor Ávila, que usted hasta la semana pasada nos dijo que nunca había escuchado de Tallahassee, sino que fue contactado por la agente Jason Newman respecto a este caso en particular.
Le dije que el caso me había enterado, pero ¿quién no conoce ¿quién no conoce la capital de un país a través de noticias? A la capital, yo le digo, conozco que era la capital de la Florida.
I found out about the case, but who doesn't know what the capital of a state is, just even through the news? I knew what the capital of Florida was.
So last week, when you told us during that phone conference that you'd never heard of Tallahassee until you spoke to Investigator Newland, that wasn't true.
Entonces, la semana pasada cuando hablamos por teléfono, usted le dijo a la gente que nunca había escuchado de Tallahassee, eso no fue la verdad.
Del caso, le dije yo, de Tallahassee, o sea, el caso solamente me enteré en el 2016, cuando me llamó el señor Newland. Pero yo, ¿cómo no voy a conocer, no voy a saber que existe Tallahassee en el mapa si yo le escribí al gobernador Jeb Bush desde la prisión en el 2016, en el 2006?
The case in Tallahassee, I did not find out about the case in Tallahassee until 2016, but who doesn't know where the capital of Tallahassee is? I wrote the governor, Jeb Bush.
Well, that's what I'm trying to clarify. The question previously posed to you was back to back. Have you ever been to Tallahassee? Have you ever heard of Tallahassee? The answer to both of those questions was no. 1 week ago, you said you'd never heard of Tallahassee until you were contacted by Investigator Jason Newland.
Entonces, hace una semana usted le hicieron dos preguntas. Si había usted estado en Tallahassee o si sabía dónde era Tallahassee. Su respuesta a ambas preguntas, una después de la otra, fue no al investigador Jason Newland.
Sí, me preguntó que si yo había estado en Tallahassee. Le dije que yo jamás había estado en Tallahassee. Esa fue la pregunta. Y yo le dije que jamás.
He asked me if I had ever been in Tallahassee, and I told him I had never been in Tallahassee. That's what he asked me. He asked me if I had ever been there.
Sir, let me clarify. I'm not talking about what Investigator Newland asked you. I'm talking about what I asked you 1 week ago. Have you ever been to Tallahassee? Have you ever heard of Tallahassee prior to being contacted by Investigator Jason Newland?
Caballero, no le estoy preguntando yo acerca de lo que le dijo la agente Jason Newland. Le estoy hablando acerca de la conversación que yo mismo tuve con usted hace una semana, en la cual le pregunté si usted había escuchado de Tallahassee, o si había estado en Tallahassee, o si había escuchado de Tallahassee. Y usted contestó a ambas preguntas que no, y eso fue antes de la conversación con la gente de Jason Newland.
Me disculpa, pero lo que pasa es una cosa, que la traducción, a la hora que el señor está traduciendo, se le escucha bien, pero la traducción por teléfono, yo estaba en una fábrica donde el rumor era difícil. La forma como usted me llamaron, yo estaba trabajando. Incluso que hasta tomé un tiempo que no podía tomarlo, me había podido echar del trabajo, 2 horas. Y el rumor del personal que trabaja, el rumor de las máquinas no deja escuchar bien. Pero yo lo que le entendí fue que si yo había estado en Tallahassee,
You'll have to excuse me, but now that there's a proper translator and it's not over the phone while I'm at the factory working with all this background noise, and incidentally I took some time off of work that I shouldn't have taken off, that I could have gotten fired for. I took 2 hours out of my time, and while I was sitting there talking to you, there was a lot of background noise from the factory, and I couldn't hear well. So I thought what you asked was if I had ever been to Tallahassee, and I answered that no, that I had never been to Tallahassee.
So last week, when you told us you could talk to us without a problem, it wouldn't be an issue. That wasn't true. Your testimony now is that you could have been fired for talking to us while at work.
Entonces, la semana pasada cuando le preguntamos a usted que si tenía algún problema con hablar con nosotros, usted dijo que sí, no había problema. Eso no fue la verdad, porque ahora nos está diciendo que lo hubieran podido haber despedido del trabajo por hablar con nosotros.
O sea que yo me salí cuando le dije que no podía, pero o sea que sí podía, porque yo en primer lugar no tampoco pensé que era todo ese tiempo. Pensé que era una breve pregunta que me iban a hacer, pero no me dijeron, son 2 horas que vamos a estar con usted. Si me dicen 2 horas, yo les digo, no puedo, pero usted me dijeron, le vamos a hacer unas preguntas, y por eso no sabía que era todo ese tiempo.
I took the time out to talk to you, and I did not know that it was going to take that long. I didn't know that it was going to be 20 hours or 2 hours. You just told me that you had a couple of questions for me, and I thought that it would be brief. Had I known that it would have been a 2-hour conversation, I would have not been able to talk to you.
Okay, well, let me ask you a yes or no question about this, just for clarity's sake. Have you either in custody or out of custody ever been to Tallahassee, Florida?
Bueno, entonces déjeme clarificarle una pregunta, sí o no. ¿Usted en algún momento en su vida bajo custodia o por fuera de custodia ha estado usted en Tallahassee?
Nunca he estado en Tallahassee.
I've never been to Tallahassee.
Then let me ask you to clarify this, referring to your previous recorded interview, starting on page 6, line 18 of the transcript you have there, where you initially indicated that you, after being taken into custody in St. Petersburg, were taken to Tampa, after Tampa to Tallahassee, but then you clarified that perhaps it was Monroe or Orlando instead. Can you clarify for me, where was it that you were taken? Were you ever in custody taken to Tallahassee, or was it someplace else?
Puede clarificar entonces usted lo siguiente, en la transcripción de la declaración grabada que usted proporcionó, página 6, línea 18, indica que usted fue transportado de San Petersburg a Tampa, después de Tampa a Tallahassee, pero después indicó que no sabe si, no está seguro si fue de Tallahassee o fue Monroe. Entonces, ¿nos puede clarificar usted si en algún momento estaba en Tallahassee?
Que yo fui transportado a Tallahassee, yo le dije, espérese, es que nosotros vivimos en Tampa, Orienro, y después fue a, no es Tallahassee, a mí se me olvidan esos los nombres de Estados Unidos, se me olvidan, no lo tengo presente, pero eso fue los lugares que yo recorrí, o sea, en County, que no eran prisiones. Bruce Lee, le dije, Bruce Lee, el otro, no, es que parecido como Tallahassee, pero no es Tallahassee, disculpe.
Tallahassee, no. I was transported from Tampa to, I don't know, I can't remember the name. I have trouble remembering names from the United States. The places that I've been to that were county jails, they weren't prisons for the county. I was in Brooksville, and then I was in another place that sounds similar to Tallahassee, but that isn't Tallahassee, so I have to apologize.
Okay, so that was just a mistake when you said you were taken to Tallahassee, that wasn't the case.
Entonces eso fue un error cuando usted indicó que lo había llevado a Tallahassee, no fue el caso.
Me equivoqué, o sea, es otro nombre que está ahí, o sea, pero no es Tallahassee, o sea, otro nombre que está en un county que está cerca pero tal vez, porque se me está metiendo Tallahassee, puede haber nombrado Tallahassee, pero yo en Tallahassee no, porque me parece que esto es lejano, es muy lejos de ahí de Tampa, donde yo estaba.
It wasn't Tallahassee, and I apologize. It might have been a place that is close to Tallahassee, and because of the proximity, I just had Tallahassee in my head, but I've never actually been to Tallahassee. It's not very close to town. Tallahassee, no.
Okay, regarding your criminal drug trafficking case that was prosecuted out of Tampa, Florida, you didn't cooperate with the United States government initially, correct?
Ahora, referente a su caso de tráfico de droga que fue procesado en Tampa, Florida, usted no cooperó con las autoridades inicialmente, ¿es correcto?
No.
No.
And so, except for a short misunderstanding between you and your cartel associates, where they believed you were cooperating at the very beginning of your case, neither you nor your family was ever in any danger of physical harm, correct?
Entonces, salvo a un malentendido con el cartel, durante el cual al principio del caso ellos pensaron que usted estaba cooperando con las autoridades, usted y su familia en realidad nunca han estado en ningún peligro.
Mi familia toda vive en Colombia, yo voy a Colombia y camino tranquilo. Yo no tengo problema porque ellos saben que yo no cooperé, no testifiqué en contra de nadie.
My family lives in Colombia, and I go to Colombia. When I do so, I walk in peace because they know that I did not cooperate.
I'm asking you about what danger, if any, you or your family was in immediately following your arrest in the year 2000.
Le estoy preguntando yo acerca de qué tipo de peligro corrían usted y su familia inmediatamente después de su arresto en el 2009.
Ahí sí corría peligro si yo fuera cooperado, porque mi jefe estaba libre e incluso recibió mi esposa, no era mi esposa, la mamá de mi hija recibió amenaza.
They would have been in danger if I had cooperated because my boss was still out free, and then my wife, I'm sorry, she wasn't my wife, but the mother of my daughter received threats at that time.
And was that a different person than the woman you're married to there in Italy?
¿Esta es una persona diferente a la mujer con la cual está casada usted en Italia?
Sí.
Yes.
Okay, so she received a threat at the very beginning of your case when your associates believed you were cooperating with the United States government.
Bueno, entonces ella recibió una amenaza al principio del caso por parte de sus asociados porque ellos pensaban que usted estaba cooperando con el gobierno de los Estados Unidos.
Sí, fue a causa de otro capitán que empezó a cooperar y pensaron que era yo el que estaba cooperando.
Yes, this was due to another captain that started cooperating, and they believed that it was me who cooperated.
They quickly discovered that that was not the case, though, correct?
Pero ellos se enteraron rápidamente que ese no fue el caso.
En el mismo día, porque al otro día que llamé a mi casa, mi jefe llamó y pidió disculpas.
The following day, because the same day, because the following day when I called the house, my boss called the house and asked, he apologized.
So your associate, your boss, who had previously made the threat and who believed that you were cooperating, called back the same day to tell the mother of your child that he was sorry, that there was a misunderstanding.
Entonces su asociado, su jefe, que fue el que hizo la amenaza inicialmente a la madre de su hija, él volvió a llamar ese mismo día para disculparse.
Sí, al siguiente día.
That's the following day.
Okay. So then there was never a strong, tangible, or imminent threat. Is that right?
Entonces nunca existió ninguna amenaza tangible ni inminente, ¿correcto?
No.
No.
Okay. What about during the pendency of your criminal case in 2000 and 2001, as your case progressed, were you or any member of your family back in Colombia ever in any danger?
¿Qué tal durante su caso, mientras su caso estaba pendiente entre el 2000 al 2001, en esa época estaba en peligro usted o alguna persona de su familia en Colombia?
Sí, en el 2000 fue cuando él llamó a la mamá de mi hija y le dijo que de qué me había servido mantenerme callado por un tiempo y si ahora estaba cooperando. Pero era mentira.
It was in 2000 that my boss called the mother of my daughter and told her what good had it been for me to for such a long time if I was then cooperating at that time. But that was a lie.
So, I guess the answer to that question is no. As your case progressed with you not cooperating with the United States government, neither you nor your family was in an imminent or tangible risk of physical harm.
Entonces la respuesta sería no. A medida que progresó su caso con el gobierno de los Estados Unidos, parece que usted no estaba cooperando, usted no está en peligro y tampoco su familia.
No.
No.
Okay. And after you were convicted and sentenced and remained in custody in the United States, at that point, were either you or your family back in Colombia in danger? Were you in danger of physical harm to yourselves?
Bueno, ya después de que usted lo condenaron y lo sentenciaron, cuando estaba prestando sentencia en los Estados Unidos, ¿usted estaba en peligro o su familia en Colombia corría algún peligro?
No, ninguno.
No, nada.
Okay. And what about when you were deported back to Colombia? At that point, were either you or any member of your family in any danger of reprisal from the Colombian cartel?
¿Qué tal cuando lo deportaron a Colombia? ¿Usted cuando regresó a Colombia estuvo en peligro? ¿Usted o su familia estuvieron en algún peligro de retaliación por el cartel?
Ninguno.
No.
And that's because you hadn't cooperated against any person, correct? You just offered testimony about your own conduct?
Y fue porque usted no cooperó en contra de ninguna persona, es porque usted solo ofreció testimonio acerca de su propia conducta, ¿correcto?
Ah, obvio. Sí.
Obviously, yes.
So in spite of your cooperation, your testimony is that the Colombian cartel had no issue or problems with you upon your return to Colombia in 2009.
Entonces, su testimonio es que, sin importar el hecho que usted haya cooperado, el cartel colombiano no tuvo ningún problema con usted cuando regresó en 2009.
Cuando yo salí, la organización estaba en prisión.
When I got out, the entire organization was in prison.
So you were never in any danger in your own mind?
Entonces, según su parecer, usted nunca estuvo en peligro.
No, yo no estuve nunca en peligro.
I was never in danger.
Do you agree that if you cooperated in 2001 during the pendency of your case initially, that you or your family may have been at risk for physical harm?
¿Está de acuerdo usted con el hecho de que si usted hubiera cooperado en el 2001, usted y su familia hubieran estado arriesgándose?
Record, for the record, I'm going to object, that's a speculation.
Objeción por especulación.
I'll rephrase the question.
¿Puedo volver a formular la pregunta?
Back in 2001, during the pendency of your criminal case, did you believe that either yourself or your family would be in danger of physical harm if you cooperated with the United States government?
La pregunta la hago de esta manera. En el 2001, ¿pensaba usted que hubiera estado en peligro usted o su familia si hubiera cooperado con el gobierno de los Estados Unidos?
Si hubiese cooperado, sí, estaría en peligro.
If I would have cooperated, yes, we would have been in danger.
Okay. Now, when you did finally cooperate in 2008, I just want to be clear, that was only to help frame the context of the conspiracy. You didn't offer testimony against any person, correct?
Bueno, ahora hablando acerca de su testimonio del 2008, usted, su cooperación solo fue para dar un marco de referencia a lo que fue la confabulación mayor. Usted no cooperó en contra de ningún individuo en particular, ¿correcto?
No.
No.
Okay. Now, when you got back to Colombia in 2009, what was your plan?
Cuando usted regresó a Colombia en el 2009, ¿cuál fue su plan?
Pensé no volver a la pesca porque la pesca ya no había pesca.
I thought that I wasn't going back to fishing because there was no longer any fishing.
Okay. When upon your return did you make contact with your now wife?
Cuando usted regresó, o después de que usted regresó, ¿en qué momento entró en contacto usted con su esposa de hoy en día?
Tenía 8 días de haber llegado a Colombia. Llegué el 8 por la noche de abril. Y el 9 ya me reuní con mi familia, con mis hijos. Y el día 18 de abril me llamó ella de aquí de Italia para ofrecerme si quería venir a vivir a Italia.
It's 10 days after I arrived. I arrived on April 8th, and I reunited with my family on April 9th, and then I got a call from Italy from her on April 18th to ask me if I wanted to go to Italy to live with her.
And she was an old girlfriend of yours from high school, correct? You had been out of contact with her for many years as of April 2009.
Y ella era una exnovia del bachillerato suyo y habían estado por fuera de contacto muchos años antes de que llegara el 2009. ¿Correcto?
No, mi esposa no. La primera esposa fue la que yo conocí en el bachillerato, pero yo con ella viví 7 años. Tuve dos hijos y nos separamos.
Not my first wife. I'm sorry, not my current wife. My first wife I met in high school, and I was with her for 7 years. We had 2 children, and we separated.
Okay, so clarify for me then where your current life was when you got deported back to Colombia in 2009.
Entonces, por favor, me clarifica su esposa de hoy en día en dónde estaba cuando usted lo deportaron a Colombia en el 2009.
Ella estaba aquí en Italia, ella se vino a Italia. Yo la conocí a ella, a mi esposa, la que es esposa mía ahora, yo la conocí en el 97. O sea, yo tenía 2 mujeres. Era ella y la otra, la mamá de mi hija.
She was in Italy. She had moved to Italy. I had met her in '97. At that time, I had 2 women. I had her and the other woman, the mother of my children.
Okay, so your current wife was one of 2 women you saw for a period of time in 1997.
Entonces, su esposa actual fue una de 2 mujeres que estaba viendo usted por un periodo de tiempo en el 97.
En el 97 la conocí a ella y comenzamos a vivir de ahí porque ella es viuda, su esposo murió en el 94 y comenzamos a vivir sin casarnos desde el 97.
I met her in '97. We started living together because she was a widow. Her husband died in '94, and in '97 we started living together without getting married.
Okay, and had you been in contact with her during the time when you were in custody in the United States?
¿Y usted muy bien? ¿Y usted se mantuvo en contacto con ella mientras que estuvo bajo custodia en los Estados Unidos?
Hasta el 2005, no, hasta el 2006 estuve en contacto. Y ahí yo le dije que hiciera su vida porque mi sentencia era muy larga. A las 2 le dije que hiciera su vida. Yo me separé de las 2 cuando estaba en prisión.
In 2006, we separated. I told her to move on with her life because my sentence was too long. Both of them. I separated from both of my women in 2000.
Okay, so as of 2009, you hadn't been in contact with her at all for 3 years, correct?
Entonces, para el 2009 usted no había estado en contacto con ella por ya 3 años, ¿correcto?
2 años y medio llevaba que yo no la llamaba a ella.
And it had been 2.5 years since I had called her last.
And you hadn't seen her in person in over 12 years, since 1997.
Y usted no la había visto en persona por más de 12 años, desde el 97, ¿correcto?
El 29 de diciembre del 2010 fue cuando ya volvimos a vernos desde el 2000 que nos separamos.
On December 29th of 2010 was the first time we saw each other after we separated in 2000.
Okay. All right, so you meet up with her in 2010, and shortly thereafter moved to Italy with her, correct?
Entonces usted se reúne con ella en el 2010 y en diciembre del 2010 y poco
No, ¿puedo aclarar algo en la fecha? 2009, el 29 de diciembre del 2009 fue que ella llegó a Colombia.
I need to clarify something about the date. It was actually 2009. It was December 29, 2009. She arrived in Colombia.
Okay, but in any event, shortly after that, you moved with her to Italy.
Bueno, pero sin importar, usted se mudó con ella a Italia poco tiempo después de eso, ¿verdad?
Si nos casamos, ella trabaja con la misma cooperativa que yo trabajo desde el 2008.
Yes, we got married. She works for the same cooperative that I work for. She's been working for them since 2008.
All right, and the reason you moved to Italy was not because you were in danger of reprisal from any cartel for having testified on behalf of the United States government. Is that correct?
Entonces, la razón por la cual usted se mudó a Italia no fue por temor de alguna retaliación de algún cartel colombiano por haber cooperado con los Estados Unidos, ¿correcto?
No, solo fue porque ella me invitó a vivir acá.
It was only because she invited me to live here.
Okay. Now, you indicated previously that the members of the Colombian cartel for whom you had previously worked were all in custody as of your return to Colombia. Is that what you said?
Ahora, usted hace un momento anticipó que los miembros del cartel colombiano con los cuales usted trabajaba ya estaban bajo custodia cuando usted regresó a Colombia, ¿es correcto?
Sí, es correcto.
Yes, that's correct.
Isn't it true, Mr. Avila, that you told us last week part of the reason you moved to Italy was that you didn't want to be tempted to fall back into drug work with your former associates, that they were trying to re-recruit you?
Señora Ávila, cuando tuvimos nuestra conversación, ¿no es cierto que usted nos dijo que una de las razones por las cuales se mudó es porque quería evitar la tentación de volver al narcotráfico, que sus asociados del pasado están tratando de volverlo a reclutar?
Cuando yo salí, que llegué a Colombia, a los 3 días tenía de cuando me hicieron un ofrecimiento.
When I left and when I arrived in Colombia, it was only 3 days before I got an offer.
When you left Colombia,
When I left and I returned back to Colombia.
when you were deported to Colombia,
Cuando usted lo deportaron a Colombia?
Cuando me deportaron, sí.
When I was deported, yes.
you're saying what happened within a few days of your return?
¿Qué fue lo que pasó? Pocos días después de que usted llegó,
Me ofrecieron un viaje.
they offered me a trip.
I thought you said there was no day. I thought you said they were all in custody of that.
Pensé que usted había dicho que no habían ellos más.
No.
Estaban bajo.
No, ellos no era el cartel, no era la organización, todos estaban presos, eran tantos, en Colombia no solamente un cartel, son tanta gente que trabajan con esto.
It was a different cartel. There's not just one cartel. It wasn't the same people I was working with. There's not just one cartel. There's many people working with me.
Well, how would a rival cartel know to contact you within 3 days of you returning to Colombia?
Entonces, ¿de qué manera fue que un cartel rival supo contactarlo a usted solo 3 días después de su regreso a Colombia?
¿Me repite la pregunta?
Can you please repeat the question?
Yes, sir. How is it that a rival cartel with whom you had no prior association would know to contact you and try to recruit you to work for them within 3 days of you returning to Colombia?
Sí, caballero. ¿Cómo fue que un cartel rival se enteró de su llegada a Colombia y supieron para reclutarlo para hacer otro viaje dentro de tanto poco tiempo de haber regresado?
Yo llego a Buenaventura donde tanta gente me conoce. Necesitaban capitán.
I arrived in Buenaventura, where a lot of people know me, and they just needed a captain.
Yes, sir. Let me just ask this question as I'm getting close to wrapping up here. Just to clarify, not only do you not know anyone by the name James Carlos Santos, you've never spoken to anyone in person or by phone with that name either. Is that correct?
Déjeme clarificar ya que estamos aproximando el fin. Usted nos había indicado que usted no conoce a nadie de nombre James Carlos Santos. ¿Nunca ha visto, nunca conoció, nunca ha hablado por teléfono con un tal James Carlos Santos?
No, señor.
No, sir.
Okay. And in closing, just to clarify here,
again, when you offered testimony on behalf of the government, it was really just about your conduct and not against any other person.
Solo para clarificar, cuando usted dio su testimonio para el gobierno, fue únicamente acerca de su propia conducta y no fue algún testimonio en contra de nadie, ¿correcto?
No, yo no hablé en contra de nadie.
No, I did not speak against anybody.
Can you explain that in his order reducing your sentence, why a federal judge wrote that you cooperated conspicuously and testified decisively against one of the princes, if not the king, of the Colombian cocaine realm in which you formerly operated?
¿Me puede explicar por qué el juez, cuando le redujo la sentencia, indicó que usted había cooperado de manera notable y decisiva en contra de uno de los príncipes, sino uno de los reyes del mundo de la cocaína colombiana, en el cual operaba previamente?
Ok, mi jefe fue el que entregó a la organización.
Okay, my boss was the one that turned it into the organization.
So your testimony is that where the judge says you personally testified decisively against one of the princes, if not one of the kings of the Colombian cocaine realm, that wasn't true. Someone else testified against the princes.
Entonces me indica usted que acá, cuando notó el juez que usted había atestiguado decisivamente en contra de uno de los príncipes y de pronto hasta reyes del narcotráfico de cocaína en Colombia, ¿eso no fue usted, eso fue otra persona?
Le digo, mi jefe fue el que entregó a toda la organización y después él empezó a cooperar. A mí me llaman porque él me metió en el grupo, pero yo no testifiqué en contra de nadie.
Let me see. My boss was the one that turned in the organization. He's the one that started testifying against them, and when he started doing that, he pulled me into that same group. But I never testified against anybody.
So then your sworn testimony, is that the judge's statement that you cooperated conspicuously, testifying decisively against one of the princes, if not one of the kings of the Colombian cocaine realm which you formerly operated? That wasn't true. His statement was not true.
Entonces su testimonio acaba de escribir la declaración del juez, en la cual indica que usted atestiguó de manera notable y decisivamente en contra de uno de los príncipes, sino reyes del mundo de la cocaína colombiana. ¿Eso no fue cierto? ¿Que lo que dijo el juez no es cierto?
Pues yo estuve en un juicio que duraron 3 semanas y vi cómo es un testigo. Está una persona en este juicio que se llama Iván González. Pero a mí no me preguntaron, ¿usted conoce al señor Iván González? ¿Usted trabajó con él? No me preguntaron absolutamente nada. ¿Puedo continuar o traduce?
Un momento, the interpreter would like to receive clarification for a moment. ¿Cuánto tiempo duró el juicio?
El juicio de nosotros, cuando a mí me juiciaron, duró 3 semanas y por eso me di cuenta que cuando un testigo va, tuvieron tantos testigos en contra mía, le preguntan si conoce a la persona. Pero a mí no me preguntaron nada y yo les dije antes que yo no conocía a ninguno con ese nombre.
I had a week. I had a trial for a period of 3 weeks, and in that trial, I was able to notice how it is that witnesses are interrogated and how they ask them if they know so and so. And when I was called to testify, and I was asked, the trial was against Mr. Ivan Gonzalez, and I was asked if I knew him, and I answered that I did not know him. I didn't say anything against him.
Okay, so when in the very next line, the judge writing your order of sentence reduction says, a review of the transcript of Benona's trial testimony against Gonzalez Bejarano, and then goes on to explain your testimony. That wasn't true either. You didn't testify against Mr. Gonzalez Bejarano.
Y en la próxima línea, en donde se indica que un repaso del reporte presentenciario de Quiñones, el repaso de la transcripción indica que el testimonio que presentó Quiñones en el juicio en contra de González Bejarano Y después continuó. Entonces, eso no es cierto. Usted no presentó testimonios del señor González Gavarán.
Pues a mí me preguntaron cuántos viajes hizo. No sé si esto tenía relación con él, pero a mí o sea, yo dije lo que les dije a ustedes, los viajes que hice, pero yo no testifiqué de que yo conocía al Señor. No sé cómo planificaron. Yo dije solamente los viajes que hice, pero no fue que yo en contra de él.
I was just asked how many trips I made. I was never asked about him. I didn't know how things operated, and in the trial I never said anything against him because I didn't know how he was involved. So I told them what I told you already, just how many trips I took.
Okay, so then to clarify, the answer to my prior question is yes. The judge's characterization of the testimony is incorrect.
Entonces, para clarificar mi pregunta, la respuesta a mi pregunta es sí. El juez de hecho caracterizó equivocadamente su respuesta.
No puede ser totalmente porque yo de pronto mi jefe, que es el que estaba cooperando, había podido decir que esta droga que él mandó conmigo era del Señor, pero yo no lo escuché en el juicio, en este testimonio. O sea, no lo escuché que dijera, esta droga es de él.
I didn't know because it's possible that my boss made an arrangement to send the drugs to this individual, but I was never told that that was the case. I was just transporting them from one point to the other. I didn't know that that's who they were going to.
I see. Mr. Avila, can you explain why your DNA was located at the scene of the murders issue in this case?
I'm going to object to that because there's no speculation and also not support of that.
Go ahead, Mr. Avila. Can you explain why your DNA was located at the scene of the murders in this case?
Sora, ¿la puede explicar usted por qué se encontró su ADN en la escena de estos asesinatos?
Que si puedo, ¿qué? No le entendí bien.
I can explain what? I didn't understand that.
If you can explain why your DNA was found at the scene of the murders in this case.
Si puede explicar usted por qué su ADN fue encontrado en la escena de estos asesinatos.
Pues a mí me parece extraño porque yo nunca estuve en esta fecha, nunca he estado en Estados Unidos y por eso y todas las pruebas que yo tengo, yo era seguro cuando la Interpol me llamó, yo era tan seguro y dije, no, este no puedo ser yo.
It is strange to me because I've never been there on that date. I have never been in the United States, and I didn't have any concerns when the Interpol called me because I knew that it wasn't me.
I have no further questions.
Ninguna otra pregunta.
Mr. Avila, I got a couple of follow-up questions, very brief.
Señor Ávila, tengo unas breves preguntas de seguimiento.
The trial that you testified in, who was the defendant?
En el juicio, durante el cual usted presentó testimonio, ¿quién fue el acusado?
Iván González,
Ivan or Iván González.
You did not know who he was at that time, correct?
Usted en esa época no sabía quién era él, ¿correcto?
cuando me mostraron la foto, el fiscal que vino a visitarme, yo le dije que yo no conocía a esa persona.
When I was showed a photograph by the prosecutors that came to visit me, I told them that I had never met that person.
So what you told the court was the trips that you made, correct?
Entonces el tribunal lo que le informó fue acerca de los viajes que usted mismo había llevado a cabo, ¿correcto?
Porque eso fue la pregunta que me dijeron, señor Ávila, ¿cuántos viajes usted hizo durante el tiempo estuvo metido en el narcotráfico?
Because that's the question that I was asked. And I said, Mr. Avila, how many trips did you make during the time that you were involved in drug trafficking?
Is it fair to say that you were not the only witness during the course of that trial?
Sería justo decir que usted no fue el único testigo en el transcurso de ese juicio.
Había muchos.
There were many.
Muchos testigos que testificaron en contra de él porque ellos lo conocían, pero yo no conocía a ese señor.
Many witnesses that testified against him because many people knew him, but I never gave testimony against that individual.
Did you not give testimony against that individual because you were trying to protect him, or because you just didn't know the information?
Usted no dio testimonio en contra de ese individuo sencillamente porque lo estaba tratando usted de proteger o sencillamente porque no tenía conocimiento.
Porque yo no lo conocí, yo no conocía a ese señor jamás.
I never met that man.
Hold on. I have no further questions at this time.
Ninguna otra pregunta.
Thank you all very much.
Gracias a todos.
Hold on, there. I apologize. I apologize, I do have one more question. Mr. Avilo, you said you were contacted by Interpol.
Señora Ávila, tengo una pregunta más. ¿Me indicó usted que lo contactó la Interpol?
Sí, la Interpol acá en Italia.
Yes, Interpol here in Italy.
And you were asked to give a DNA sample, correct?
Usted le solicitaron que diera una prueba de ADN, una muestra de ADN, ¿correcto?
No, la Interpol solo me dijo que un magistrado de Estados Unidos necesitaba comunicarse conmigo a través de un teléfono fijo.
No. All Interpol told me was that a magistrate in the United States needed to communicate with me via landline.
Okay. And you were called and eventually ended up coming to Rome to meet with Agent Stanford there to give a DNA sample, correct?
Usted lo llamaron y eventualmente fue a Roma a reunirse con el agente Sanford para presentar o dar su prueba, muestra de ADN.
Antes de venir a encontrarme con el agente Sanford, me llamó el fiscal, el investigador Newling.
Before meeting up with Agent Sanford, I got a call from Agent Newland.
Y él me dijo de que me acusaban en Estados Unidos.
And he is the one that informed me what I was being accused of in the United States.
And then after that, you freely traveled to Rome to give that DNA sample to Agent Stanford, correct?
Después de eso, usted viajó libremente a Roma o a su propia voluntad a Roma a proporcionarle a la gente Sanford su muestra de ADN, ¿correcto?
Y en este lugar, aquí en la embajada, estuve el 26 de septiembre del 2016.
Yes, here at the same location at this embassy, I was here on September 26, 2016.
And you did that to clear your name.
Usted hizo esto para aclarar su nombre, ¿verdad?
Para aclarar, y estuve decidido incluso ir directamente a Estados Unidos para aclarar esto.
To clear it, and I was even willing to go all the way to the United States in order to clear this up.
And unfortunately, you can't come into the United States, can you?
Pero desafortunadamente usted no puede ingresar a los Estados Unidos, ¿verdad?
El señor Newell me dijo, mejor es que lo hagamos de allá porque no es fácil que usted venga para acá.
Mr. Newland told me it's better if we just do it from over there because it's not easy for you to be able to link it over here.
And in fact, part of your deportation is that you cannot come back into the United States, correct?
De hecho, parte de su deportación incluye el hecho de que no puede regresar a los Estados Unidos, ¿correcto?
Lo sé que yo no puedo regresar, pero si era para aclarar esto, creo que me daban un permiso el gobierno federal para poder entrar, solo por aclarar este caso.
I know that I'm not allowed to go back, but I believe the federal government would give me permission to go back if it is for the purpose of clearing up this case.
Instead, we're doing this via this closed circuit television with the U.S. Embassy, which is U.S. law.
Pero en vez entonces estamos llevando a cabo esta conferencia por circuito cerrado de televisión desde la embajada de los Estados Unidos, que es terreno estadounidense, ¿correcto?
Sí, correcto.
Yes, correct.
Thank you very much, sir.
Muchas gracias, caballero.
Nada.
Thank you.
Everybody awake. Sometimes after lunch it's tough. You need a break. Everybody falling asleep. Now we'll take 10 minutes. Yeah. Okay. Everybody okay? All right.
Now this time say we recall, Agent Pat Sanford.
You remain under example.
Yes, sir, Your Honor.
Have a seat. Let up the rail, please.
Thank you.
Agent Sanford, you set up two meetings there in Italy with Mr. Avila. Did you experience any difficulties in communicating with him, basically because of language barriers?
Yes, I did.
Could you please tell the jurors about those?
Each time I met with him, I was trying to set up the arrangements on it, what time to meet and where, and there was still difficulties through email and stuff. He'd have to get it translated, but then once he did arrive at the embassies, I each time tried to relay little things like, would you like a cup of coffee, things like that, and that was about the extent of what he could understand. I ended up having to get a translator just to have a normal conversation with him for him to understand anything I was saying.
Okay. In doing and arranging these, there's also, especially with the video we just saw, there's difficulty also regarding timeframes.
Yes.
Could you please explain that?
The time frame as far as when we were going to arrive there, is that what you're referring to?
Time differences. It's noon, 12 o'clock here is not 12 o'clock there, is it?
Right. The time difference is 6 hours ahead in Italy. So 6 at night, it would be 12 noon here. 6 in the morning here is 12 noon there. So trying to explain to him what time we're going to meet, what time we're going to get together was very difficult because he didn't understand what I was saying, so I had to get translation services to assist with it.
So even just fundamental conversations about time of day, cups of coffees and things along those lines, even then you couldn't communicate with them, correct?
That's correct.
Now, both prior to and return after the video, as a special agent, you have access to database regarding immigration, especially specifically Mr. Avila.
Yes, we do.
Were you able to verify that Mr. Avila was in fact in custody until his deportation in 2009?
That's correct.
So he was in custody
He
the
was
entire
in
time?
custody until he was deported out in 2009 through Houston, Texas, I believe it was.
Okay. And so at any point during that time frame, while he was in the United States, during that, he was not out of custody, correct?
That is correct. He was not out of custody.
You also have the ability to go back and check to verify about any further visits or anything along those lines. Well, let me ask you this. His deportation, he wasn't allowed back in the United States, correct?
That's correct. Once they're deported, they're not allowed to come back in.
And did you go back and verify that he has not returned to the United States since that time?
That's correct. I did verify that there was no record of him ever returning whatsoever to the United States.
No further question. I'm sorry.
Cross.
Hold on. No further question.
Just very quickly, to clarify, when you say he didn't come back to the United States after being deported, you simply mean that he didn't come back legally. If he entered illegally, there wouldn't be record of that, correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. No further questions.
All right, you can step down. Oh, we take 10 minutes? Either side need anything?
Negative. Yes, Your Honor. The state intended we call a witness now, but then we would play the video of Mr. Kelsey Kennard, and we would ask the court, we would make a motion to play prior recorded testimony due to his unavailability, and I didn't know whether you want to take up that testimony now so that we can move into it, or whether you want to take another break.
The defense dispute that Mr. Kennard's unavailable.
No, if Mr. Duke says that he's unavailable, then we'll accept that.
Okay. I think based upon the motion that I signed off on for the material witness warrant and stipulation, the council will accept that Mr. Kennard is currently unavailable despite efforts by the state to get him here. What did y'all figure out on Bossio's part?
We also have a second video for Vassio that has the few questions from Mr. Prince, and then the follow-up rebuttal questions by the state that's been recorded. It's a 2-minute video. We're anticipating playing that. There also is a stipulation we have regarding Mr. Kennard. He, following his testimony, got a reduction in sentence. We have a stipulation for that.
You have that?
Mr. Prince is that. This is just for record purposes. What I have in my hand, I want to mark it a court exhibit. This is the documentation that we did to get, to try and get Mr. Kennard here, just for record purposes. That does not go back to the jury.
There's one additional issue that I would raise. I didn't have a chance to talk to Mr. Dukes about it because I just found out a second ago. Apparently there was a jury question for Mr. Kennard last time where he was asked what type of firearm, and he said he thinks it's a 9mm, which is obviously important testimony.
Is this mic on, Judge?
What?
Is his mic?
No.
I missed that one, so did I. We both missed that. I would just propose if we could have a few seconds, I'm sure we can figure out a stipulation to address that rather than trying to edit that in.
Or if we take a break after I play it, that I can run upstairs and re-record it. It literally is 3 minutes.
Why don't we just announce to the jury what was said rather than get into all that? We're just killing time.
Yeah, for the transcript.
And I will say, there was also a follow-up jury question that the court asked, and this was the question and answer.
I'm no objection to that, Your Honor.
All right, so we're gonna tell them Mr. Kennard is unavailable, and trying to decide what to tell them about Bossio. I think it's really just a kind of a fairness issue. I think, I'd say, rather than requiring Sergeant Bossio to come back up here, we just decided we publish his prior statement on this subject. Everybody okay with that?
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, sir, that's fine.
Okay. All right, please.
All rise for the jury.
We're gonna do the video first.
I'm sorry?
Were you gonna do the video
No,
first?
Dr. McIntyre.
Oh, okay. All right, you remain under oath, Dr. McIntyre. You can have a seat.
Thank you.
State your name again for the record, please.
Kevin McElfresh.
Hold on, Your Honor. Assume not disputing the unless. Good afternoon again, sir.
Good afternoon.
Dr. McElfresh, in your duties in contract, I guess, with the state in order on this particular case, were you also asked at some point to do a comparison between a buccal swab that came from Angel Avila and compare it against a phone cradle? And that buccal swab would be defense exhibit number 10. The phone cradle is defense exhibit number.
You're looking at that, kind of convoluted.
I'm sorry. And defense exhibit, electropharogram would be defense exhibit number 12.
Yes, sir.
And did you perform that comparison?
I did.
What is this?
I'm sorry, that's the wrong one. That's the wrong one. Okay, let me rephrase it. You asked to do a comparison of a buckle swab from Angel Avila
Yes,
and compare it to an electropharogram that is exhibited here in Defense Exhibit 1A and B, which would be from a foam cradle, correct?
correct.
Okay. So let's talk about what we're looking at in this particular case. Whenever you first analyze what you see here in Exhibit 1A and B, this was not developed by you, it was developed by Joe Allen Brown, correct? The electropharogram?
That's correct.
All right. So as well as the buccal swab was developed additionally by Florida Department of Law Enforcement, correct? You didn't develop that as well?
That's correct.
Okay, but then you got the results of those and did the comparison?
That is correct also.
Okay. When you first take a look, and I know we talked about your normal procedure that you utilize when we talked about the grab bar, but in this particular case, we're talking about this exhibit right here. How do you go about first analyzing this and making determinations?
Well, the first thing you have to do is look at the electropharogram and get a good sense of what the results are telling you. And by that I mean, do you have a lot of DNA? Do you have a mixture? How many people are in the mixture? And then whether or not you have a major or minor component. Because all of those things, especially in a mixture, become important as you begin to interpret what that mixture might mean. So for example, if you determine that this is a two-person mixture and you really have no data for it to be a 3 or a 4-person mixture or other extraneous data that you can't explain, then you have to look at your reference samples eventually, and you have to decide what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. And all of that needs to fit together as a composite whole. What you don't want to have to do is start invoking exceptions, if you will, that require you to say, well, I really think it's this, but I'm going to ignore this other thing for a while and see if I can come up with explanations. The objective here is to gather the data from the mixture itself.
Okay.
Do your comparisons and then see how the data fits. You're not fitting data to comparisons, you're fitting the comparisons to your data.
Okay. So as it relates to Defense 1A and B, did you make a determination whether or not this is a single source or a mixture?
It's a mixture sample of 2 individuals.
Okay. How do you make that determination in looking at this electropharogram that there are 2 individuals? Could there, okay, okay, good.
Okay. This is basic genetics. Okay. We get half of our DNA from our mom and half of our DNA from dad. So in a situation where you see, for example, where you see these 2 large peaks right here, those are likely to be from a single individual, and one of those peaks came from mom and one of those peaks came from dad. If we see more than 2 peaks at a specific locus, then there has to be more than 1 individual there. If it's more than 2 and 4 or less, then it's 2, right? And you just simply work through multiples of 2, but it's not quite that simple. Because, for example, like I discussed when I was here last, brown eyes are fairly common in the population. So I might expect that in some instances, I would only get 3 or 2 peaks, even though I might have 2 individuals with the same 2 peaks, because everybody had brown eyes. So you have to look through all of the data, and you look through the entire data set and get the story of the data. And when you determine it's 2, it's because you've looked at all of this data in composite, and nowhere do you see more than 4 peaks.
Okay.
So it's collective data.
All right. And so nowhere in 1A or B do you find any more than 4 peaks that would be indicative of a mixture containing more than 2 persons.
Correct.
Okay. And in fact, intentionally made and noted on the bottom of this, correct?
Correct.
Is it possible this is a mixture of more than two persons?
Unlikely. The problem is the population genetics piece comes in, and at some of the loci, like D21S11, for example, this locus happens to have what you could think of as a very high information content. That is, there are a lot of alleles at this locus, and they're very different between individuals. So that if I had a mixture of 3 or 4 people, I would expect to see many more peaks there than I see in this particular result. And the same is true for a number of other loci where you have very high information content relative to some loci like THO1 or sometimes CSF has a low information content.
That CSF, TXO1, what
Those
do
are
you-
all loci names that you'll see on the electropharogram. These are the names like FGA. There's D21S11 there. And so all of those, you can see we only have 2 peaks. And in fact, because we only see 2 at D21S11, this tends to indicate to me, in addition to having these being very small, that there might be missing data there. But nonetheless, you're looking at all the data collectively, and there's just no place that you can look at and say, well, this really could indicate more than 2. So this is a 2-person mixture.
Okay. So when you do this, do you also make a determination? I noticed that up here we have, where we were talking about earlier, we have the 4 peaks. 2 of them appear to be the same, and 2 of them are pretty close to being the same as well, but different sizes. What does that indicate? What are we talking about there?
What we're talking about there is what's called a major and a minor profile. And basically what this means is that we would expect when we're looking at comparisons that we're going to see one individual that has a profile that is, I can see mine down here, that would be 15, 18, and the other person is going to have a profile that is more the 14, 17, right? So one person's contributed more DNA than the other person, so we're going to see more of their peaks than we are the other person.
Okay. And did you go back and make a comparison earlier? We had showed you looked at States Exhibit number 148, which is all of the results as it was of the victims as well as Mr. Segura. Did you go back and take a look at this and make a determination as to any of those being the major contributors?
Yes. When I looked at this, what I saw was that we had the major contributor was most likely Brandy Peters.
Okay.
That her DNA, you can see the 15, 17 here. Her DNA tends to be those large peaks, so that would appear to be her profile. And then at VWA that you just pointed out, again, she's the 15, 18, which are these 2 tall peaks.
Okay. All right. So if we found this to be a 2-person a mixture, that leaves those other 2 peaks as the other person. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So whenever you're examining this and comparing it against Angela, well, let me ask this. Were you able to rule out whether or not Tamaya, Tanaya, Peters, Javante Segura, and Henry Segura were a part of this mixture?
Yes, they tended to be excluded from this, but this data is not as complete as it could be, so it was difficult to do some of those exclusions. Tanaya tended to have DNA that was in the mixture, but they would have been masked by Brandy at most of those locations. Similarly, when I looked at Mr. Segura, it would appear he was not in the mixture because there were places where his DNA was missing.
Okay, just so we're clear then, did you find that Tanaya and Tamaya were a part of this mixture or not?
I couldn't really determine conclusively whether they were.
Okay. All right. So then let's take a look then. Did you also compare Mr. Avila's testimony? Or I'm sorry, Mr. Avila's DNA?
I did compare his DNA, yes.
Okay, and did you make any determinations about whether Mr. Avila is present in this particular case?
He is excluded from being a part of this mixture.
Why?
First of all, there are a number of places where his DNA is simply missing. That is, when I look at it, if he was there, I would expect to see his DNA, and I don't. And then when you take that into account and you begin at looking other locations, so for example, at VWA, where we were just talking about, Mr. Avila is a 1718, okay? So, but the problem is the minor component here is a 1417. There's no 18 at all. So you have to argue that somehow his DNA is partial.
All right, let me stop you there. There's no 18. I thought right here it says there's a major that's an 18.
I'm sorry. Let me look again. I'm sorry, it's the wrong combination is what I'm trying to say. The minor combination is the 1417,
Okay.
not the 17, not the 1718. Okay?
Okay.
That's
So
what I'm
you're
trying
talking about the combination of the two smaller peaks.
Right.
Is what you're talking
The
about.
smaller combination is 1417 here.
Okay.
Okay, so that's the DNA pattern that I'm looking for to be part of that, and he's not. And the problem compounds itself, because if you say, well, he does have a 1718, and there's a 1718 there, but one of them's the tall peak and one of them's the minor peak, then this has to be a three-person mixture, right? Because we haven't explained this other peak over here. And we have to say, well, somehow that this minor combination that appears to be a combination of a single individual is in fact multiple individuals combined differently than we see it in the data. We have to effectively invoke an exception here.
I don't understand at all what you just said. So you are saying, earlier we talked about this being a two-person mixture, and you're talking about in order to explain that 14, you've made a determination that it's actually a three-person mixture?
No, you would, in order for you to invoke the explanation that this 14 and 17 were somehow indicative of a person who could be a 14-15, or that we have a 17-18 combination that's out of balance like this, means that you have to suggest there's a third person, because you haven't explained all the data. Whereas if you say this data is the two prominent peaks of 15-18 and the two minor peaks of 14-17, you have a consistent answer. It's consistent with the two-person mixture. It's consistent with Mr. Avila being excluded and his DNA not being in that mixture. So then you have all of your data lines up. It's a two-person mixture. Mr. Avila is excluded. And while we haven't identified the 14-17, this 14-17 nonetheless isn't indicative of Mr. Avila. If you try to make his data part of this, then what happens is you have to have these two peaks that are imbalanced, which leaves the other peak sitting outside unexplained, and the only way to say it is explained is now to invoke a third person. And we don't have any data for three people.
Okay, let me make sure I understand you here. So, Mr. Avila, if we look at what the data says as being a two-person mixture, because you have four peaks and nowhere else in the electropharogram is there indication of a third donor by a fifth, sixth peak.
Correct.
We are looking at a two-person mixture.
That's correct.
And because we're looking at a two-person mixture, as finding Brandy Peters as the major donor at a 15 and 18, and Mr. Avila would be a
17, 18.
17, 18, excuse me, I'm looking at the wrong chart. A 17, 18, that 14 is left unexplained, and therefore, because of that, it cannot be Angel Avila.
That's correct.
Okay. Now, in order to get that to be explained, or include Mr. Avila, you would then have to assume a third-party donation there that is not reflected in any other data that's in this electronic paragram. Is that what you're trying to say?
That's exactly what I'm trying to say.
Okay. Well, let me ask you a question. if someone were to exclude Tamaya and Tanaya for part of this mixture, okay, there's a finding of an exclusion that Tamaya and Tanaya aren't a part of this, but that Tamaya and Tanaya carried a 14 allele at that location, at loci, at VWA. Could you then include it to try and explain away that 14?
No, you don't. You don't get to exclude somebody, but say, well, I might see a little bit of them, and
Why not?
well, partially because all of your DNA is there or not, even if you have an incomplete pattern. There's enough information in these electropherograms. We have RFU values over 1,000 in some instances, where we just don't see their DNA where we should. So once you don't see it, then that explanation's out. That's not available to you.
Okay.
And again, this is where what you have to do is look at the data and let your data lead you to the explanation rather than the explanation lead you to the data.
I think that what you're talking about is like an analysis bias.
It can be. The difficulty in all of these kinds of analyses are that you have the combination of genetics, population genetics, the interpretation, knowing what the background of these alleles are and these loci, and it is possible to get completely confused trying to figure out if any of the data makes sense. And so you end up having to step back again and again as you begin working on the data and working through it. Step back, look at the raw data, go back, make some comparisons, step back, look at the raw data and say, do these comparisons make sense? Go back to the raw data. It's very iterative as you work through this information. This is why interpretation guidelines can be very restrictive for some laboratory systems because of exactly this problem.
Okay. So in this particular case, Joe Allen Brown makes a determination that the minor is a 14-17 and Mr. Avila is a 17-18, Brandy is a 15-18, and that leaves that 14 unexplained and therefore would exclude Mr. Avila.
That's correct.
Is that the only spot that we're talking about with Mr. Avila and excluding him in that situation?
Mr. Avila is what at that point?
Mr. Avila at VGA, I'm sorry.
He is a 17, at 17, 18 at that location. And
Mr. Fuchs said 14, 17.
I believe what I was trying to say is that Joe Allen Brown made a determination that the minor was a 14-17. Mr. Avila is in fact a 17-18.
That's not what you said.
Okay. Thank you, Your Honor.
Correct.
Thank you.
actually, this exchange is exactly indicative of how you have to sort of iteratively work through these kinds of results, because you're dealing with 14, 15, 17, 18, and those combinations. And it actually makes the math somewhat complicated when you do include somebody, because you're effectively having to work through possible combinations versus real combinations. And that's often what happens, is people will say, well, I can maybe include this person, but then I have to invoke a different explanation. What you have to be careful of is not doing that, but coming up with a comprehensive data analysis.
Okay. So let's also take a look, if we can, real quick at D5, which is this one right here, correct?
Yes.
All right. In this one, Ms. Brown determined that the major was an 11-11,
Yes.
and that is same as Brandy Peters, correct?
Yes.
And then she made a determination that they are start alleles, but that the minor was a 7 and a 12, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Is Mr. Avila a 7 and a 12?
No, he's an 11-12.
So again, we have a 7 allele here that is part of this mission, identified as the minor contributor, that is not consistent with Mr. Avila's
That's correct.
DNA. Okay. So we have two specific spots right there where minors are determined that are not consistent with Mr. Avila's DNA. Does that eliminate him as being a sample, the contributor to the minor DNA?
Yes, yes, that's exactly one of the things that eliminates him.
Is there anything else that eliminates him?
Just a moment here. Once again, if you look at locus TPOX, we yes, that's on page 2. That we colloquially refer to that as TPOX. It's a very similar situation. Yes. Okay. You have an 8-9 as your major profile identified. The minor is 9+, but you'll see that designation 9+ means I see a minor peak there at 9. There might be something else, but I'm not sure. Well, the problem here is that Mr. Avila at TPOX is 911, okay? And you can see there's no 11 at all, right? There's simply no data for an 11, which is his allele. And that's one of the things you look for is, okay, even if I explain some things as being either stacked or covered up by having the same allele as the major, here's a place where he has an allele that just isn't there. And you either have to invoke dropout, which could be an explanation, but in light of all the other data that you see, it's also more consistent with him being non-contributor to the sample.
Okay. So we have VWA, D5, and TPOX. Anything else?
Let me just check quickly my notes. The same situation for D18, S51. If you look at that locus, and I apologize, we're back on page 1, right? And this is this locus right here. So again, we have a major at 17, 19. The minor is 18, and for this locus, he's a 15, 18. And we don't have the 15, right? There's an 18 there, but we don't have any 15 down here, which would be right in this area here, called by the computer. So again, when you start saying, if I argue and conclude that he's excluded in this sample, this is another indication where here's an allele that should be there that isn't. And that is consistent when you take all of this information together that we've been talking about. The most reasonable explanation is he's excluded from this sample.
Okay. And that's an important point, obviously, is that you can't just take each one of these alleles individually. You have to look at all of it as a whole, correct, in order to make these determinations?
Yes, and that's a very important point. All of this data, you have to consider everything you're looking at as a whole. You can't pick and choose. And you can't invoke, for example, the explanation you mentioned earlier that, well, maybe this one peak is actually contributed by a person who I said isn't there, but I'm just only seeing this one location. that's inconsistent with the rest of the data we see here. And this is a complex mixture, that's clear, but it isn't impossible to interpret. You just have to be careful that you come up with a consistent answer that works through all the data.
Okay. And the consistent answer that you determine is a two-party there's a two-party mixture, and that Mr. Avila is not present in this mixture, correct?
That is correct.
No further questions.
Just a few questions. I'm not going to dive way back into the nuance of the interpretation here. You indicated we have to look at the data set as a whole, correct?
Correct.
And when you mean the data set as a whole, you mean this specific electropharogram. You're not taking into account what other findings may have been made on related items. And let me be a little more precise about what I'm asking, I guess. This was a profile developed from the swab of a phone cradle, correct?
Yes.
And so you're not going to take into account whose DNA is on the handset that goes with that phone cradle or the cord that goes with the phone cradle, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And you said to do the best interpretation here, you want to try to avoid invoking exceptions like dropout and like masking. Did I understand that correctly?
You want to avoid those explanations as best you can. If those explanations become the overriding explanation, if dropout is the explanation you're invoking everywhere, at some point you have to say, I'm sorry, this sample's inconclusive. So it's a balance. It's a balance between the data you have, the data that could be there but isn't showing up, and the results from the comparisons.
Okay. And to be clear, though, dropout is prevalent throughout this complex mixture, correct?
There is dropout.
And likewise, there could be masking going on as well, correct?
There could be, yes.
Okay. So I guess the phrase exception, to be clear, doesn't mean exactly the same thing. It does in normal vernacular. You refer to those things as exceptions, but at least as it pertains to dropout, for example, we know that is in fact occurring with this sample, right?
It is a factor occurring with the sample, so what you have to do is, like I showed a minute ago, look for areas where you can see data and that data is inconsistent with an individual or includes an individual. In this case, it excludes Mr. Avila.
And I think you were referring to TPOX on the co-filer page where you're talking about only 3 allele were showing up, right?
Correct.
All in low RFU value, correct?
That's correct.
And so unless, for example, an allele is being masked at that locus, then we're dealing with dropout there again, correct?
Not necessarily. It depends on what the other contributor's DNA is.
Let me go back to that one real quick so the jury can see what you and I are talking about.
Yes, good idea. I think.
So at TPOX, there's a third locus.
Which one you're referring to, which?
This one?
That one right there, yes. It's the 8, 9, and 10 alleles.
So either dropout or masking has to be taking place there, correct? Because nobody has one allele at any locus, correct?
Exactly the point. That isn't there, and that excludes Mr. Avila.
What my point is that either dropout is going on at that locus or masking is going on, because there's only 3 numbers and we know there's 2 contributors, right?
There's 2 contributors, and it could be that there's an 8, 10 is your major. It could be, you notice that this 8, right? That 8, let me make sure, yeah. That 8 could be compared, right? Because this peak, this 8 peak is higher than the 10 peak. So we have the 9 down here. We're missing 11. It could be that that 8 is masking, and so you have an 8, 9, 8, 10. So that's consistent with a 2-person mixture. But what we don't have is the 11.
Well, you've told us before, a minor deviation in RFU value, like we're talking about here, less than 200 RFUs difference between the 8 and the 10 there, that may not necessarily mean that another allele is being masked, correct? There could be another allele number that's just dropping off right there. Is that correct?
It is possible, yes.
Okay.
I didn't quite follow your math on that, Mr. Prince.
Yes, sir, let me
You're
clarify.
between 544 and 331, so it's,
Right.
I don't think that's 100. My math isn't great, but I don't think that's 100.
No, I said about 200 RFUs.
Okay,
Difference
okay.
right there. That's statistically insignificant, a difference of about 200 RFU, right?
It is, but the problem here is that because of the level of DNA in this sample, and also the hard part is that you have to see that the scale on this is very high, relatively speaking, so that, you're looking at 0 to, this is going to scale out at 1500 on the top, and we're looking at allele peaks of 544 and 331. So they're going to be compressed, so it's not as clear as it could be. And overall, this sample is not terribly imbalanced. So again, as
It's not terribly what,
imbalanced. So because you've got a major and you've got a clear major, you can look at certain pieces of this. And again, this is how you you go in, you look at the sample, you look at comparisons, you step back. Does that comparison make sense? You go back and read. It's a very iterative, very intense process.
okay. And you agree with the general principle that as you're reading an electropherogram from left to right, you're gonna get lower quantitative values for the biological material showing up as you go across, correct?
Yes, the PCR is less efficient as the DNA fragment length gets longer.
And so that's why we see these RFU values going from amylogen and across the CFS, they're consistently dropping, right?
Typically, yes, but you'll notice that in some of these reactions, this is called a multiplex reaction. So you have many reactions going on at the same time in the reaction tube. And because of that, some will in fact decrease in value, but some maintain pretty stable. This was true for the profiler, co-filer kits in particular.
And that's gonna be the case sometimes when you're dealing with relatively low RFU values, touch DNA, correct? A lot of times you'll see slight variation where a locus to the right will have higher RFU values than the one to its left, is that correct?
Yes, I think you said that right.
Yes.
I was trying to follow you there. The point is that typically this is the lowest molecular weight DNA in the reaction, and these are the highest molecular weight DNAs. And as we proceed from this point to this point, we will see some drop in RFU values because the overall reaction efficiency drops some.
Okay, so bottom line is, you're not comfortable saying that the twins, for example, are kicking in at certain locus with respect to this mixture. The simplest explanation from your perspective, so that you can avoid calling masking or calling dropout, which you've identified as exceptions, is just to say this is a clean two-donor mixture and Mr. Avila is excluded.
It is a two-person mixture and Mr. Avila is excluded.
Okay, and to be clear, there's the minor contributor to this mixture is a male, correct? Because we see at amylogen and there's male DNA present, right?
There is some male DNA, and as you can see right here, because females have 2 X chromosomes and male 1, this is roughly a 3-to-1, if not 4-to-1 relationship. So you're looking at some male DNA, but not very much.
Which is why the minor contributor relative to Brandy Peters, that's the person you would expect to be the male, correct?
That is the best explanation.
Okay, and I think I heard you indicate during direct, you said Mr. Segura is excluded as a contributor, which means Mr. Segura's DNA is not in this mixture, correct?
That's correct.
And similarly, Javante Segura is not a contributor to this mixture. He's also excluded, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so in any event, this is a foreign male, that is a male contributing to the mixture that's not Javante Segura and not Henry Segura.
That's correct.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Yeah.
juror have a question of this witness? You accept it? How long is this video?
22 minutes. What's that? 22 minutes.
Okay. All right, next thing we're going to do, let me get gathered up. You're going to hear and see a video of an individual named Kelsey Kennard. The state has been unable to secure the attendance of Mr. Kennard despite extensive efforts to get him here. Therefore, we're going to present his prior testimony. You should consider this video as you would any other evidence. And you have a transcript to follow along also.
I do, Your Honor. Give me one moment. One moment, Your Honor.
mistaken, roughly about a week.
During that time period, did you and Mr. Segura have an opportunity to talk, obviously?
Yes, sir.
While Mr. Segura was there and talking, did he ever talk about why it is that he's been present?
Yes, sir, he did.
Did he ever give you any information? What did he tell you about that?
Oh, he told me he was incarcerated for murder and that he was just being picked up from Minnesota, I think, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay. Did he give you, at any point, did Mr. Segura tell you anything about whether he did?
At first he kept talking about it, and then I kept telling him, like, don't tell me your case. And then the next day he kept talking about it, but after about the third day, yes, sir, he went in full details of what he was in, what he was charged with.
When you say the first time, the first 3 days, you tell him not to talk to you, was it saying anything at that point?
told me that he was from Florida. He had killed. He had killed 4 people and went to Minnesota. And I was like, oh, don't tell me your case. And I told him, don't tell nobody your case.
They told you.
Yes, sir.
What did he tell you on the third day about that case?
Well, he had told me that he killed his baby moms for because him or her was going through some child support issues or something like that, and he was upset because she was obviously had more money than him, and she wouldn't take him off because he had a little boy or something by, and he killed her and the kids and everybody.
Okay. Did he give you, and so he says that there was a money issue having to do with, child support,
Yes, sir.
and he was upset because she barely had more money. Did he give you any other details regarding it?
Well, if I'm not mistaken, he was like that. He knew that she was something with some drugs or something, and he tried to get her to take her off child support, and she wouldn't. And he like, I just lost it.
Did he say anything about who was present, or how he did? Let me ask that, did he say anything about how he did?
He shot her and one of the kids, and he drowned 2 of them.
Did he give you any information about why it is he would have shot 2 but then only drowned 2?
No, sir, he didn't.
Did he give you any information about, whether or not all 4 of those persons were there at the same time, or anything along those lines?
No, because like I said at first, I could tell it was bothering him, right? And then when he started telling it out, like, listen, I'm gonna do what you really don't want to tell your case to like that, right? And so he kind of started stumbling around, but he was making rap songs about it too, so
What do you mean he was making rap songs about it?
he was actually rapping about it.
What was he saying in the rap?
How he had killed her and the kids, and he was nothing to be played with.
Did he make any statements to you about where he may or may not have hidden any kind of murder weapons or anything like that?
Yes, sir. He had I think a wife or something and at this time that the gun that he used was supposed to be at her house in an old car or something in the motor, something to that nature.
Did he tell you anything about that kind of car or car?
No, sir.
Did he tell you anything else regarding, these murders, the rap songs you're talking about? Was that just one time or over time period?
Nah, like for the whole week he was in there, he was making all kind of raps, but that one rap, he wrote several to him. I think I actually mailed him out to somebody, like his wife or somebody, because when he left him behind. And I had, like when you leave Oklahoma City, you can't take nothing with you. So I actually had to put my name on the mail and send it out to I think it was his wife or somebody.
Anything else he told you regarding these murders?
Yeah, it was this one girl he used to go with. He had went to her and asked her about a gun or something, and she denied it. She wouldn't get the gun for him, and he was like, if he get out, he was gonna kill her too.
Did you just talk to him the one time? I know he had a rap, but did you just talk to him the one time about the cases? Or is
Nah, we spoke several in that week. We spoke several times.
the information you're talking about, did that all come out at the one time, or did it just over the course of that week?
Over a course of that week.
At some point, did you tell law enforcement about the statement that Mr. Segura?
Yes, sir, I did.
Why did he tell law enforcement?
Well, for one, I'm a father. Yes, sir.
And two, you have children of your own.
Yes, sir.
Are you also looking to get benefit maybe of sentence reduction?
But as you know, the government can never promise you nothing, but it's an and/or situation. I could, but I couldn't.
Yeah. But you're hoping for it.
Yes, sir.
Based upon that, does that mean you're being untruthful?
No, sir.
Well,
Mr. Canard, how many times at all have you been convicted of a felony offense?
I think 5.
And you've got 11 years served at this point. How much did you have served back in 2011? About 5 years or so?
No, actually, I received one time credit already. I had 16 years and 8 months, and they reduced it to 14 years.
So you were originally sentenced to 16 years,
Yes, sir.
and at some point it got reduced to 14 years.
Yes, sir.
Was that on a post-plea sentence reduction?
Again, my plea deal was if I had any criminal activities that I knew about, I was supposed to report it. So I did. At that time, they didn't give me nothing that sentence. So when they convicted the people that was involved with me at that time, they later reduced my sentence.
They reduced your sentence based on the government filing a motion for substantial assistance,
Yes, sir.
which you didn't have at the time of your plea.
Nah, I cooperated, but it's a process in the federal system that has to go through a whole lot of investigation, billing cases and things of that nature. And when you actually do get locked up, they might let that person out to cooperate. So when that person gets to cooperate, and then they come in, they too receive a time cut, and then that's when I get mine as well.
So you were originally sentenced to 16 years. You got a time cut on a subsequently filed motion for substantial assistance, correct?
Yes, by the government.
And the government is the only party that can file a motion for substantial assistance, correct? That's your
No.
understanding?
No, I can file one if I feel like that my assistance that I turned over to the government was substantial enough. Yes, I can file one under a motion to compel the government and lay grounds out why. And then it's the government, which is my USA attorney, if she feel that my assistance was substantial enough, then she would grant me one.
You're aware, sir, that not even a federal judge can compel a U.S. attorney to file a motion for substantial assistance unless they're withholding it for like racial or gender reasons, right?
I mean, when I filed mine in 2011 and 12, that's what I filed under, and the government told me if I withdraw, they would grant me mine. So that's what they did.
So they granted you one already,
Yes, sir.
and you're hoping for an additional sentence reduction.
Yes, sir.
And when you say you would be prosecuted, you're aware you wouldn't actually be prosecuted if you didn't tell them anything. A condition of your plea was that you testified truthfully, if called upon to do so, regarding criminal activity that you had knowledge of, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So you're aware then that it's not actually a criminal offense to not proactively report a new offense.
Well, all I know is my plea agreement stated that, and that's what I must do.
Okay. So your understanding of your plea was that you would be charged with new offenses if you didn't come forward.
Yes.
Okay. I noticed when Mr. Fuchs asked you why you were coming forward, first thing you mentioned is that you're a father, and he had to kind of drag out of you that you want a sentence reduction. Why were you hesitant to give that information?
Well, I don't think I was.
But he
because it's something that's already noted, and we don't have to turn the information over.
You don't have to turn what information over?
That we will receive a time cut. We don't have to state that for the record.
Are you saying it's your understanding you will receive a time cut?
No, I said that in the federal system, we do not have to state that we will receive a time cut, or we will or we won't. We don't have to state that.
I see.
We don't be asked those questions.
I see. Okay. Let me ask you about these raps that you say Mr. Segura wrote or sang. Was anybody else around when he did those raps?
He had several homeboys there that I also told him not to talk to his case about, but I can't, like, it's been a little while ago. There was two other dudes there from Florida at that point, and I can't remember their names, and
Okay. And so the two people who would have been able to corroborate your story about what Mr. Segura said, you never provided that information to law enforcement.
no, I didn't.
And likewise, the written rap that you say would have corroborated what he was saying about these offenses, you sent that off to his wife and also didn't provide that to law enforcement.
I think in my original letter I did, I told him that, because I wrote the courthouse, I told him that they can check my car log, because I not only sent letters to his house, I spoke to his wife. If you go back to 2011, you can see his phone numbers on my list, where I called her several times for him and spoke with her while he was there and after he left.
My question is, you sent the rap that you claim he wrote to his wife, not to law enforcement, correct?
Yes, that's what he asked me to do with it, because he had other mail in there too.
And so all of the corroborative evidence that would have supported what you were saying, the other witnesses' names and rap is gone, right?
I sent it to his wife.
My question is, that evidence is gone,
I sent it to his wife.
okay? And likewise didn't provide law enforcement with the names of people who could have corroborated your story. Is it true?
I sent it to his wife.
I saw that you mentioned during questioning with Mr. Hughes, you said that you told Mr. Segura you're not a guy that he wants to be talking to about his case.
Yes, sir.
Are you somebody who, besides the time you've already told us about, when you got a 2-year sentence reduction, has either cooperated with the government or attempted to cooperate with the government to get a sentence reduction for yourself in the past?
Well, I never, his situation, I never ran across nobody like that, but yes, I have cooperated with the government on a high level, and it's never been a doubt about my cooperation.
So you're somebody who's eager to cooperate with the government?
No, I'm not eager, but again, my plea agreement stated that if I have criminal activity knowledge, I must turn it over.
Okay, so over what period of time have you been cooperating with the government, providing information to them about criminal offenses?
Oh, several years now on several cases.
How many cases?
I can remember correctly, like 3, 4, maybe.
Okay. Been to court to testify in these cases?
Yes,
Okay. Is that why you got the sentence reduction, you came to court and testified against the defendant in that other case?
yes, sir.
Okay.
But he actually pleaded out though, once he seen they had me, he actually pleaded out.
How many times have you attempted to provide assistance to the government? Meaning, reach out and contact, or have your attorney reach out and contact somebody from the government to tell, hey, I've got information about another case for you?
Again, in the federal system, it works different. Once you turn the information over, it might be an ongoing case that they may don't even use you because they might have enough people already, and then it could take years on down the line. So it could take maybe 10 years just to build this case on a certain individual. So it's probably still ongoing cases that I gave information on that they just haven't used me for yet.
My question is, how many times have you either provided information or attempted to provide information?
I can't give you an accurate number on that. It was several cases.
More than 10?
No,
You don't know how many times you've attempted to provide information?
no.
How many times you've provided information that hasn't come to fruition in the form of a motion for substantial assistance?
I can't give you an accurate number on that.
Isn't it true, Mr. Kennard, that the reason you said Mr. Segura shouldn't talk to you about what he was accused of doing, what he was alleged to do, is because you're somebody who takes information like that and uses it to try and put yourself in a better position with respect to sentencing?
No, I just give the government the truth.
Redirect? Yes, Your Honor, actually, there's a couple questions to ask that would be more subject before we call it a roll. Thank you. When Mr. Segura was there with you, did you have any trouble sleeping?
Yes, some nights he used to just wake up and you could hear him moaning and he'd just get up because we was allowed 2 chairs in the room. And he'll get in this chair and sit at the foot of the bed for a few hours.
Did he ever wake up screaming as if he had a nightmare or something?
Yes, sir, he did.
At some point, did Mr. Segura talk to you about the fact that there were only 2 people at the house initially, but 2 more people came home?
No, sir, he didn't. I can't recall that.
Remember talking to law enforcement officers back in November of 2011 when they came to see you?
Yes, I think, one of the ages, I can't,
Mr. Investigator Bosio, sound right?
yes.
All the
Vincent,
time?
Vincent,
Yes.
yes, sir.
Would help refresh your recollection if I showed you a copy of the report that contained the information that you had?
Yes, sir.
Right, first off. Without reading this, read this to yourself. How's that one?
told me it was a car sitting in his yard at his wife house, him and his wife house or something, and the car was there.
Okay. And you put it in the motor, in the actual motor or the motor area?
In the motor area, I guess, because I don't think you can put a gun in the actual motor.
That's why I asked the question. Thank you, sir. No report.
Collect the transcript. There were another couple of questions after that we can't show you on the video, but I'll just read the question and answer these. Said, did Mr. Segura tell you anything about the type of gun he used? The witness said, I think, if I'm not mistaken, and I could be wrong, but I think it was like a 9mm or something. And then the question was, but it was a pistol, is that what you're saying? The witness indicated, yes, sir. Then there was a question, I guess that would have been a semi-automatic then, right? The witness said, I'm not really too familiar with guns, so I don't know the difference between them like that. The question, you don't know about whether 9mm come as revolvers, you only know that it was 9mm. The witness answered yes. So that was the testimony, further testimony presented by Mr. Kennard. There is a stipulation from the parties that followed as to Mr. Kennard, said that Mr. Kennard was called upon by the state at an earlier stage of these proceedings to testify before the court. At that time, Mr. Kennard was serving a federal prison sentence. Following his testimony in this case, Mr. Kennard received a sentence reduction for having cooperated with the state. We also are going to present a short clip from, forget whether it's Lieutenant or Sergeant Basio. It's a very short segment. This would be, rather than require him to come back up here, we're just going to provide we do have this on the video of his brief testimony on this subject. This would have been testimony elicited by the defense.
And Your Honor, also I have, it's already been introduced into evidence as to Exhibit 135, which is the document that indicates that Mr. Kennard and Mr. Segura were in fact in federal custody at the same location in Oklahoma City.
I do.
Have a seat. Next one, please. Detective Austin, could you introduce yourself? First and last name for the court reporter.
Sure. My name is Sergeant Vincent Basio. My first name is V as in Victor. I-N-C-E-N-T. My last name is Basio. B as in boy. O-C-C-I-O.
Detective Basio, you were the one, along with Henry Johnson, who went to Texas at some point during the investigation of this case to meet with Kelsey Kennard, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And because he was in a federal correctional institution, you weren't able to bring in recording equipment, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. You recall that conversation that you had with Mr. Kennard at the time?
Yes.
Okay. And in recounting the details of the murder as he claimed Mr. Segura gave them to him, did he at any point ever mention anything about children?
No.
Okay. Was he able to give you any specific details about how the offense was committed back then?
No.
Okay.
In this situation also, let's talk also about Mr. Kennard. Questions were asked of Kelsey Kennard
Mr. Several. Okay, so that's what we got for the day. As I said, earlier, I told you we had one witness that had a scheduling problem today. But he was gonna have to be followed by another witness. We weren't gonna get all that done today anyway, unless we wanted to go till 7 o'clock. I don't think we wanna go till 7 o'clock Friday night. So anyway, we're gonna break for the day. Monday morning, we're gonna have two witnesses. They're both reconstruction experts. There's one for the defense, one for the state. I would hope we would be through with the testimony by about lunchtime on Monday. These lawyers are gonna have all weekend to think about this, so they might surprise us on Monday morning, but that's what I'm expecting. And we'll probably break at that point in time and come back and do the instructions and closing first thing on Tuesday morning. You may wonder why we don't just, keep it going and get it done, but we don't want to be sending you out to start deliberating at 6 o'clock in the evening. That's not fair to the case or fair to y'all. That's late, so we're gonna try to get it to you on Tuesday by lunchtime so that you have plenty of time to discuss it. As I've warned you, I don't know whether that concerns you or not, but warned you, if you don't get a verdict on Tuesday during the day, we will sequester you Tuesday night. You'll be staying in a hotel. So just be aware that's a possibility. So what I'll have you do when you come in Tuesday is just bring an overnight bag with you, in case that happens. So that's the current layout and plan of where we are. I think we're on track. Lawyers have been cooperating to keep things moving. So it's been well done. Appreciate that they're cooperating with each other and keeping things going. So anybody have questions, what's expected of you? If not, we'll see you Monday morning, 8:45, same procedure. All right, everybody be seated, please. But may have been a little short with it earlier, but had the jury waiting, so I thought I should explain my ruling on what the